You don't remember the moment you learned this rule, because it wasn't taught with words. It was taught with absence, with unpredictability, with the subtle tension of waiting for love to arrive and not knowing how long it would stay. And somewhere deep in your body, you learned that closeness was fragile, that connection could disappear without warning, that safety was conditional. And so you adapted, quietly, intelligently, painfully, by becoming vigilant, by learning to read tone before words, by sensing emotional shifts before they were spoken, by becoming what was needed before anyone could decide you were too much or not enough. And this is where the paradox begins, because what once protected you is now what controls you. Anxious attachment is not weakness, it is not neediness, it is not a lack of self-respect. It is a nervous system shaped by inconsistency, a psyche trained in environments where love came and went, where caregivers were emotionally available one moment and distant the next, where affection had conditions, where the child learned that staying connected required effort, performance, attunement, and often self-erasure, and so the body learned hypervigilance. The amygdala learned to scan for threat. The default mode network learned to loop around questions of worth and abandonment, and the child learned parentification, regulating the emotional world of adults before learning how to regulate their own, which means that as an adult, you don't just want love, you monitor it, you manage it, you guard it, because distance doesn't feel neutral to your nervous system. It feels dangerous. Silence feels like punishment. Withdrawal feels like rejection. And here is the dark rule that few ever name. Whoever controls closeness controls you, not because you are weak, but because your body learned that separation equals danger. And so in relationships, you may chase clarity, over-explain, apologize prematurely, tolerate ambiguity that hurts, stay longer than your spirit wants to stay. Not because you lack awareness, but because your system is trying to restore safety. And the cost of this adaptation is not just anxiety, it is the slow loss of authenticity, the quiet grief of becoming agreeable instead of honest, accommodating instead of expressive, patient instead of present. You learn to delay your needs, to soften your truth, to trade self-respect for reassurance. And this creates an invisible mourning, the grief of the self you could have been if love had been steady. Carl Jung spoke of the unlived life as a shadow that follows us, and anxious attachment carries the shadow of a self that never got to rest, never got to trust, never got to simply be. Instead, life becomes organized around waiting. Waiting for replies, waiting for reassurance, waiting for emotional permission to relax. And Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than reality. But for the anxiously attached, the imagination lives in the body. The imagined loss feels real, the anticipated abandonment triggers real physiological responses, and so calm feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels unsafe, and even joy can carry the edge of impermanence. And these patterns don't stop in romance. They bleed into career where authority figures become emotional anchors, into self-worth where validation becomes oxygen, into boundaries where saying no feels like a threat to belonging, into identity where you know who you are in relation to others, but struggle to know who you are alone. Yet none of this is a flaw. These are coping mechanisms that once kept you emotionally alive, strategies that made sense in an environment where connection had to be maintained, and healing does not come from shaming these patterns or forcing independence. It comes from understanding them, from meeting the inner child who learned that love was unpredictable and offering consistency, from shadow work that reclaims the anger, need, and longing you were taught to hide, from nervous system regulation that teaches your body that distance is not danger, that silence is not abandonment, that you can survive uncertainty without collapsing into self-erasure, and gradually the work becomes about choosing softness over survival, pausing instead of pursuing, self-soothing instead of self-abandoning, allowing others to show you who they are without chasing the version you hope they'll become. and something subtle but profound begins to shift. Connection stops feeling like a test. Love stops feeling like a performance. Your worth stops rising and falling with someone else's availability, and you realize that security was never about controlling closeness. It was about building a relationship with yourself